For centuries, the knight on horseback was the undisputed master of the battlefield. The image is iconic. A man of steel and muscle, mounted on a powerful war horse, thundering across the field with a lowered lance. This was heavy cavalry, and for much of the High Middle Ages, it was a force of unparalleled shock and awe. A single, well-executed cavalry charge could smash through infantry lines with terrifying speed and precision. In the 12th and 13th centuries, countless battles ended in bloody routs as infantry armies were crushed beneath the hooves of charging knights. NIF, the first ranks of spearmen or swordsmen collapsed. The cavalry would pour through the gap, wreaking havoc on the less armored archers at the rear and scattering the remaining infantry in the center. Such scenes played out countless times across Europe, cementing the knight's reputation as the supreme weapon of war. His dominance on the battlefield was a reflection of his power in society. The mounted warrior was the aristocrat, the lord, the feudal elite, who owned the land and commanded the loyalty of the commoners who tilled it. To challenge a knight on open ground was to invite certain destruction. Is never static. By the late Middle Ages, cracks began to appear in the very foundation of cavalry's dominance. Infantrymen, once dismissed as little more than expendable peasants with pitchforks, slowly discovered new ways to withstand and even defeat armored knights. The story of how this happened and how a band of rugged Swiss farmers forever changed European warfare is one of the most dramatic and transformative chapters in military history. The unrivaled golden age of the knight. Understand just how revolutionary the Swiss were. We need to fully appreciate the era that preceded them. The knight's supremacy was not just a matter of superior training or equipment. It was a total system. A fully equipped knight was an immense investment. His armor, from the chainmail and plate of his cuirass to the helmet and gauntlets, was a marvel of craftsmanship, painstakingly forged over weeks or months. But the most crucial part of his arsenal was his warhorse, a magnificent, specially bred animal trained for the noise, chaos, and danger of battle. These horses were powerful enough to carry the knight's weight and robust enough to withstand a charge, and they were worth a small fortune. The knight's value lay not only in his martial skill, but in the sheer psychological terror of a mounted charge. Imagine the scene: hundreds of armored horsemen, the rhythmic thunder of their hooves shaking the very ground beneath your feet, lowering their lances in unison. The sound of steel on leather, the gleam of polished plate, and the sheer momentum of the mass of men and beasts was often enough to shatter morale before the first collision. Against poorly trained or lightly equipped infantry, the results were catastrophic. Time and again, infantry formations collapsed under the weight of steel and horseflesh as individual knights, protected by their armor, became mobile, terrifying battering rams. This supremacy made perfect sense within the social fabric of feudal Europe. Armored knights were the warrior aristocracy, the backbone of feudal armies and a powerful political class. Their dominance on the battlefield reinforced their dominance in society, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of power. Feudal oaths and land grants tied them to their lords, and the cost of maintaining their war horses, armor, and retainers ensured that only the wealthy could afford to be part of this elite warrior class. Yet, this very exclusivity would also become a weakness. As kingdoms grew and wars became more frequent and expensive, it became increasingly difficult for rulers to rely solely on this small, mounted elite. Again, the first cracks in the armor. Yet even in the supposed golden age of the knight, there were signs that their invincibility was an illusion. Infantry victories, though rare, were not unknown, and these occasional shocks to the system became legendary. One of the most famous examples came in 1302 at the Battle of the Golden Spurs. Flemish militias, primarily townsmen and farmers, not professional soldiers, stunned Europe when they destroyed a French knightly army. The Flemings did not face the French on open ground. Instead, they cleverly positioned themselves behind a series of ditches and streams, forcing the French knights to dismount or get bogged down in muddy, treacherous terrain. The French charge, the centerpiece of their strategy, was blunted and broken before it could even begin. The Flemish infantry, armed with long spears and goedendags, a spike-ended club, then fell upon the floundering knights and slaughtered them. The aftermath was so brutal that over 500 pairs of golden spurs, the symbol of a knight's status, were collected from the slain French aristocrats. A little over a decade later, in 1314 at Bannockburn, Robert the Bruce's Scottish army faced a far larger English force under King Edward II. The Scots employed a different tactic. They used the schiltron, a dense circle of spearmen bristling with long spears, to repel repeated cavalry assaults. The English knights, unable to break the solid wall of spears, were repulsed and ultimately routed. Once again, the myth of cavalry's invincibility took a serious hit. Then, there were the English longbowmen. In 1346 at Crécy, and again in 1415 at Agincourt, English archers devastated charging French knights. These were not battles decided by terrain alone, but by a combination of discipline, preparation, and a new technology of warfare. The longbow's hail of arrows could penetrate knightly armor, especially at close range, and its immense rate of fire was something European armies had never seen before. At Agincourt, the French knights' charge was funneled into a narrow, muddy field between two forests, where they became a perfect target for the English archers. The resulting slaughter was a testament to how ranged weapons and tactical positioning could turn the tide against a numerically superior foe. Each of these battles became legendary, retold for generations across the continent. But historians warn us not to misinterpret them. These were exceptions, not the norm. Infantry could win, but usually only when terrain, weather, or clever preparation stacked the odds heavily in their favor. The knight's place on open ground was still secure. Yet, these exceptional battles planted seeds of doubt. Could disciplined infantry one day stand toe-to-toe with knights on open ground without any special advantage? Swiss enter the stage. From peasants to professional soldiers, and the definitive answer came from an unlikely place, the old Swiss Confederacy. In the early 14th century, the Swiss were a loose alliance of mountain communities, mostly farmers and herdsmen. They were not professional soldiers in the way a knight was. They were not wealthy aristocrats. They were, however, fierce defenders of their independence, constantly locked in conflict with the powerful Habsburg dynasty that sought to control their strategic Alpine passes. Through sheer necessity, they developed tactics that would shake the foundations of medieval warfare. At first, the Swiss relied on ambushes and terrain, just as the Flemings and Scots had. The Battle of Morgarten in 1315 is a perfect example. A large Habsburg army marched into a narrow mountain pass, only to be ambushed by Swiss militia. From above, rocks and logs tumbled down, while infantry charged into the bottleneck below. The mighty Habsburg cavalry, unable to even form up in the confined space, was slaughtered. These were impressive victories, but still situational. Like the Flemish or the Scots, the Swiss had to lure knights into swamps, forests, or valleys to stand a chance. That began to change in the 15th century. The invention of the pike square and the true Swiss revolution came when they refined the pike square, known in German as the Gewalthaufen, literally a crowd of force. This was not a new concept in principle. Long spears had been used since antiquity, from Greek phalanxes to medieval militias. But the Swiss innovated in two critical ways that made their formations something new and terrifying. First, their formations were unprecedentedly deep and tight. Thousands of men were packed into a dense square, sometimes 60 men deep, each carrying a pike up to 6 meters long. On the outer ranks, a solid wall of spear points bristled outward in every direction, a deadly hedgehog of sharpened steel. This sheer mass of soldiers increased stability against a cavalry charge, giving the men confidence that they were not alone. Behind the pikemen stood men with shorter weapons like the halberd, a polearm that combined a spear tip with an axe blade and a hook, and swords ready to exploit any breakthrough or fend off enemy infantry. Second, and most crucially, the Swiss used their formation offensively. Earlier infantry had used spears defensively to brace and hold a line. The Swiss Gewaltwaffen was mobile, aggressive, and capable of charging enemy lines themselves. Moving in a tight, coordinated mass, the pike square became a slow-moving, unstoppable force that could push through enemy lines, absorb charges, and then press the attack. For the first time in centuries, infantry could stand on open fields without cavalry support and hold their own against knights. Nathescone Swiss victories had a growing reputation. At battles like Loppen, 1339, and later Sempach, 1386, Swiss pike formations proved their worth. By the mid-15th century, they were not only resisting cavalry but smashing them outright. Kings and dukes across Europe started taking notice. NTHE's most famous example came in 1476 at the Battle of Grandson, when the Swiss faced Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. Charles was one of the wealthiest and most formidable rulers of his time, with a modern army that included not only knights but also artillery and professional soldiers funded by his immense resources. On paper, the Swiss should have been annihilated. Instead, the Swiss pike squares advanced relentlessly. At Grandson, their initial charge caught the Burgundian army mid-reorganization. The pikemen, a solid wall of steel points, absorbed cannon fire and charged directly into the Burgundian lines. Stunned by the unexpected aggression, Charles's forces broke and fled, leaving behind a fortune in treasures, including jewels like the Three Brothers and the Sancy Diamond. A few months later, at the Battle of Murten, the Swiss again faced Charles's army, this time defeating him in a more decisive, pitched battle. Europe was stunned. How could mere farmers defeat the might of Burgundy and its legendary Duke? NTHE victories at Grandson and Murten were not flukes. They were the culmination of a military system developed over a century of necessity. Charles the Bold was so humiliated that he was later killed in a final attempt to salvage his reputation at the Battle of Nancy in 1477. The Swiss had proven that the strength of disciplined, massed infantry could humble kings and break dukes. Swiss way of war. Why they warned historians point to several factors that made the Swiss so effective, beyond just their tactics. Their success was not just military. It was deeply cultural, aggression and morale. The Swiss fought with a near fanatical willingness to press forward, even at terrible cost. Contemporary chroniclers described their charges as terrifying, driven by what they called a, quote, primal force. This aggression was rooted in their political and social structure. As free men fighting to preserve their independence, they had a personal stake in the outcome. There was no noble class to absorb the losses. Every man was fighting for his home and his community. Discipline and training. Though not professional soldiers in the modern sense, Swiss militias trained regularly. Their pike squares required incredible coordination and collective discipline to function under the stress of battle. Every man had to trust his neighbor, knowing that if one faltered, the entire formation could collapse. Economy and mass. Compared to the staggering cost of maintaining knights, Swiss infantry was cheap to field. Ordinary farmers armed with a pike and simple armor could be trained to fight effectively without the financial burden of a mounted force. This allowed the Swiss to field far larger armies than a feudal lord could afford with cavalry, and it made them a constant, reliable presence on the battlefield. Rise of the Reichsläufer. Their reputation grew so great that Swiss soldiers became the most sought-after mercenaries in Europe. They were known as Reichsläufer, those who go on a journey, and they were hired by kings and popes across the continent. Their mercenary contracts stipulated strict rules of conduct and professionalism, and their discipline and reliability were legendary. Cavalry strikes back, but the tide has turned. NBUT cavalry did not vanish overnight. In fact, by the late 15th and early 16th centuries, knights and heavy cavalry tried to adapt. Armor grew heavier and more elaborate, so much so that by 1500, a fully equipped man-at-arms with his horse could weigh up to 150 kilograms combined. This required multiple horses and staggering expense, but it also made the knight an even more resilient tank on the battlefield. Cavalry also shifted tactics. Instead of relying solely on the lance charge, some units began using pistols and swords, developing new forms of mounted firepower. The German Schwarz Reiter, Black Riders, would perfect the caracole, a tactic where mounted troops would ride past a formation, fire their pistols, and then wheel away to reload. Yet the trend was clear. Cavalry was no longer the undisputed master. It had to share the battlefield with powerful infantry formations. From Swiss to Landsknechts and beyond NTHE, Swiss innovation spread rapidly. Soon, other armies imitated them. The most famous were the Landsknechts, German mercenaries who adopted and adapted the pike square. Battles between Swiss and Landsknechts were ferocious, often called bad wars for their brutality, as the two forces were essentially mirrors of each other, fighting with the same tactics. Elsewhere, Spain created its own version, the tercio, a truly revolutionary formation that combined pikemen with arquebusiers and swordsmen. At battles like Cerignola in 1503, Spanish gunpowder troops shredded cavalry and Swiss-style infantry alike, proving that the future of warfare was a combination of different troop types working together. Cerignola is remembered as Europe's first true gunpowder victory. By the 16th century, Europe had entered the age of pike and shot, combined formations of spears and firearms. The Swiss had sparked the change, but now others refined it further, using their invention as a template for the modern army. The infantryman, once a lowly peasant, had become the centerpiece of military power. Legacy of the Swiss pike, NTHE Swiss, didn't remain supreme forever. Gunpowder would eventually sideline their dominance, just as cavalries had been eroded before them, but their contribution was enormous, and their legacy is woven into the very fabric of military history. They proved infantry could dominate cavalry, even on open fields. They set the template for later military formations, influencing the Spanish tercio, the German Landsknechts, and the armies of the early modern period. They reshaped European armies, making massed infantry, not just elite knights, the cornerstone of war. In the end, the Swiss story is one. From a handful of mountain farmers defending their valleys, they became highly sought-after mercenaries, teaching kings and generals that disciplined, aggressive infantry could decide the fate of nations. The age of the knight had ended. The age of pike and shot had begun. It was a revolution from the ground up, a testament to the power of a determined and organized common man.